Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today we're going to work on this dresser that I picked up off Marketplace. And I don't usually buy painted furniture because I don't know what the wood looks like, but this was a great deal and it was close to home, so I decided to take a chance on it. The lady I got this from said that she refinished it a few years ago, but you never know how that's going to go. When I bought it, she assured me nothing was wrong with it. Anyway, it's going to be interesting, so let's get started. So we're just going to get started like we normally do. Going to take these drawers out and take that hardware off. And usually I put the hardware in a bucket and just give it away or something, but this hardware is brand new and it's actually the same type of hardware that me and my wife use, so I was pretty happy to see that because I don't have to order new hardware. That saves me like 40 bucks right there. I know I'm a little late posting this video, but we had a ridiculous cold front come through here, out here in Missouri, and it was way too cold to be outside in the shop. I've got 4 heaters running, and I could barely get it to 40 degrees, so it was just too cold to work out there for about a week. But I'm back, and I was able to finish this up and get this video posted. So we're just going to take these drawers and we're taking the hardware off. I'm putting blue tape over the holes so there's no dust or spray that gets shot into the drawers. And then we're just going to wrap these drawers like I'm doing here. We're just going to put paper all around and then tape all around. And you're just going to do this with all of them. So I did something a little different. I usually go straight to sanding the drawers, but this time I'm going to strip the top first. I forgot why I was doing it a little out of order. Could have something to do with the weather, I'm not sure, but we're going to get this top stripped, and then I was going to hit this with mineral spirits and then let it sit overnight to dry. And I think this was actually before the cold got through here, so I think it was still a pretty decent day when I was doing this part. But I wanted to get this thing stripped and I wanted to get it wiped down before the cold front moved in because I had a feeling it would be too cold to continue working on it. And I wanted to have this thing stripped and ready to go for when I was able to come back out. So I'm just using the clean strip stripping agent, and I'm just using an old chip brush to smear it around and get even coverage all over the top. And when you're using this stripper, you want to go heavy on it because if you go too thin, it'll dry out and then you got to recoat it. So you might as well just go heavy on your first shot. And it usually works pretty quick that way. 5-10 minutes and you're ready to go. So now I'm going to start taking that paint off. And at this point, I realize that paint is on there really good, so I felt pretty confident about the rest of the dresser. I mentioned before I don't ever buy painted furniture because I have no idea what the wood looks like. And I've been burned a couple times. That's why I don't do it anymore. Because, it might be a solid wood top that's been painted, but you'll strip the paint off and then you see that it had a huge water stain or had a huge gouge where the mirrors attached and I guess they, fell off. So now you got these huge gouges on the back where the screws ripped out of the top and then they filled it in with Bondo and painted over it. I have had some nightmares and I don't ever get painted furniture anymore. But I got this because the lady that I bought it from really assured me that it was in great shape. She just put a layer of paint over the top. She didn't even do it like professionally. It was just a dresser for her teenage daughter, so she just put a layer of paint over it and said nothing was wrong with it. So I went with it, and it was close to home, and it was a pretty good price, and it already had new hardware. So I thought, why not? And right around now, I realized that the paint that she used is hanging on really well. And I was pretty nervous about that before. You never know if people use a cheap paint or not. But This paint was really hard to get off, so I felt pretty good that it was a pretty quality paint, and I don't feel like it's going to have issues chipping off in the future. And I'm just using a grout brush to try to get this trim off. I'm using the hard plastic teeth or bristles on there. I'm not using the metal. And I probably should have stripped this front trim better because that paint did not come off, and I'm actually going to use a lot of sandpaper getting that off, and you'll see that later. So we're just going to hit it with mineral spirits so we can neutralize the stripping agent. And then I like to let it sit overnight to dry because mineral spirits it's an oil-based cleaner, and you can wipe it down and sand it and stain it in the same day. But I would recommend, if you're doing that, wipe it down early in the morning, give it about 3 or 4 hours to dry, and maybe even put a fan on it, and then you can probably start sanding and staining. And make sure you wipe down the entire dresser when you do this, because there's often a lot of drips that run down the sides of your dresser, and you want to neutralize those also, or they will continue to react even when you spray your new layers of primer and paint, and then that could chip off in the future. So while that's drying, we're going to move on to these drawers, and I'm really looking to sand out these brush marks on here. The lady painted this with a brush, so there's a lot of brush marks, so I'm not really trying to get these down to bare wood. I'm trying to sand out the old hardware marks where the holes are, because those were not done. She just put hardware over the old hardware marks, and so I'm taking those hardware marks out around those holes. But I'm also going to hit the entire drawer with 120, and then I'm going to move to 220. And I'm just going to do a quick Bondo mix up here because there were some deep gouges in a couple of the spots on those drawers. So I just figured if I'm going to mix up some Bondo, I might as well fill in some other things too. So I just lined up most of the drawers and decided to fix some of these gouges that were not super bad, but if they're there, might as well take care of them all at once. So I just line up all of my drawers, and I just go in a line because you've only got about 5 minutes to work with that Bondo. Once you mix the hardener with it, it starts reacting right away and starts drying out. And I think this entire video clip here was 5 minutes long, and I've sped it up. But I think towards the end, the Bondo was starting to harden on my cardboard plate right there, so you really don't have much time. You just gotta go in right away as soon as you mix it. And when you're mixing Bondo, you don't want to mix a giant glob and try to use that, because that will dry out before you get halfway through with it. So when you do your Bondo, it's better to do small or medium-sized globs. And I'm just going to set these aside because Bondo only takes about 15-20 minutes to dry. But with the cooler weather right now, it seems to take a little bit longer, maybe about 30 minutes to dry. Either way, it doesn't take very long. So now I'm going to hit this with some 220 and just smooth these out. I use 120 to get the bulk of material off and pretty much get it the way I want it, and then 220 just smooths it out, makes it look a lot nicer and feel a lot nicer. And now I'm going to sand the edges. I don't always do this, but with this there's brush marks on these edges too, so I'm going to hand sand these with 220, smooth out these edges also. Now I'm going to show you how I do Bondo when I sand. I've noticed before when I would come in from the side with my hand sander, it would pretty much act like a saw blade, and it would grab that Bondo and chip it out of the hole that you're filling. So now I take my sander and I just set it flat on the Bondo and smooth the Bondo out, and then after it's smoothed out you can sand like normal. And I just want to throw out a caveat there. You don't normally want to start your sander in the air and then set it down on your surface. I just do that for this particular case with Bondo, but normally when you do that you put scratches into your surface, so you definitely don't want to do that on your top. when it comes to the drawers, I'm going to paint over these anyway, so you're not really going to see, slight scratches. But if you're going to stain your tops, that stain will enhance any scratches you have on there. And if you're starting your sander mid-air and then setting it down on that top, you're not going to see the scratches with your eyes. You're going to see it once you have stain on it and you see the contrast. And trust me, nothing is more frustrating than to get a layer of stain on your dresser top and then you see scratches around the edges or wherever that you didn't sand correctly. Because now you've got stain on your top and you can't just sand it because it would look unnatural. So your best bet would be to re-strip the top, re-sand the top, and hope you don't go through the veneer. So right now at this point, I'm using my palm sander and I am working very hard to get all of that paint off, and I'm using 220 grit on here. What's nice about this top is it is solid wood, it's not a veneer, so I can sand this a little bit harder than I normally would, and as you can see, I'm working real hard to get that off, and I go through a lot of paper to finish this trim here. But with this being solid wood, if I were to take a piece of sandpaper and my sanding block and go against the grain, I would leave a bunch of scratches against the grain. So I'm using this palm sander here. It's technically an orbital sander, but it doesn't leave scratches when you're going opposite wood grain on this trim. I don't use this for a top or anything else. I only use this sander for the trim. And this is where I wish I had stripped that front trim a lot better, because this paint didn't want to come off when I stripped it, so I knew I probably should have went thicker on that, but now I'm really going to use a lot of sandpaper to get through this. And I believe I'm using 120 grit. So as you can see, I'm working really hard, and 120 grit is pretty coarse. So this paint was hanging on really well. So maybe this was 2 layers of paint instead of 1. Either way, it was a lot of work to get off. And after I hit this with 120, I went back, and you can see that pile of sandpaper on the table back there. That's how much I've been using so far. But after hitting this with 120, I went back over it with 220 to smooth everything out. So here's another extra step that I had to do with this particular dresser. Usually, with a normal old dresser, you just hit it with 220 all over, scuff it up a little bit, and then the primer pretty much hangs on to it pretty well. This is a case where there's paint all over it, and that stripper ate away some of it underneath on the trim. So you want to get all of that off and smooth that out also, so that took a little extra time to do. And it's best to get all of your side sanding done first before you move to your top, because if your sandpaper or your sanding block accidentally rides up and hits your top, you're going to sand the top anyway. But if you do the top first and then you do the sides and then you have issues with your sanding block or scratches happening, now you got to sand your top again. And if you're working on a veneer, you're really running the risk of going through that veneer. So I'm starting this top off with 120, and I usually take one piece of 120 and I just go a couple passes over it, and then I immediately switch that out, because a lot of times it will get previous finish or glue, or in this case paint, and that'll stick to the bottom of the sandpaper, and then that'll carve little squiggly lines into your top. So I usually take my first piece, I go a couple passes, and then I immediately switch it out. My next piece of 120, pretty much the same thing. and then I start using it a little bit longer to get the rest of this stain out. When I'm doing a dresser top like this, I usually go through 4 or 5 pieces of 120 and then 2 or 3 pieces of 220, just because I really want my sandpaper clean when I'm sanding. On the sides and the drawers it doesn't really matter because you're going to paint over that, but when you're staining a top, every little defect will show and you want it as clean as possible. So I make sure I go through a lot of sandpaper. I mean, it's cheap. It makes your top look a lot better versus trying to stretch, a piece of sandpaper out as long as you can, and then you end up sanding a bunch of squiggly lines into your top. You're really just wasting time in that case. And I know sanding might sound boring or intimidating, but it's really extremely important to get it right, and it's better to just go slow and play it safe instead of just jumping right in and trying to speed things up, because most of the time when you try to hurry it up, you end up making more mistakes and then you take longer fixing those mistakes. So honestly, if you just wanted to use 220 on a top and that be your only grit, it would take longer, but there's nothing wrong with that at all. I'm using 120 here because I know this is solid wood on the top. If this was a veneer and a very thin veneer, I probably would only use 220 myself. So there's nothing wrong with going low and slow, and that's the way I prefer to do it. So it takes me a little longer. It takes me about an hour and a half to fully sand a top, and that's 120 and 220. So sanding is finally done. We're going to move on to conditioning this wood, which I highly recommend that you do. It's not a requirement, but I've done it with conditioner and I've done it without conditioner, and it looks way better with conditioner. And I would recommend doing this. It's very easy to put on. You just slop it on, soak the wood down, and then you're going to wipe off the excess, and then you're going to give it about an hour to dry, and then you just come back and you can stain over it. And what this does is it goes into the dry spots of the wood, because you don't really know how old these dressers are or how they've been kept their whole life, so there's almost always dry spots in a top, and you want the conditioner to soak into those dry spots instead of your stain, because then your stain will be darker in that spot. So with conditioner, it makes your stain go on evenly across the whole top. Another thing about conditioner is it will limit the capacity of the wood to soak up stain, so you really want to get as much bang for your buck as you can, and that's why I highly recommend oil-based stains, because they give you a much richer color in one coat versus water-based stains. So my strategy for this dresser was to use this stain called aged barrel, and I've used it on pine before, and it really does look like an old barrel. And I like the color, but the strategy here was there's paint that has gone down into these knots on the top of this dresser, and pine is really known for knots. And with the white paint that's gone down in there, there's no way I could sand that out or dig that out. So I'm going to try to use this aged barrel stain. It's going to give it a grayish, smoky look also. And if it does look like an old barrel, then it could look like an old painted barrel that someone used for this dresser top. That was my thought process behind this. But I'm also needing a lighter top because the paint color that we picked out is a dark color. So I like to have a contrasting either dark top and light paint, or light top and dark paint. And this stain is actually pretty thin, and it's easy to wipe on and wipe off. Some of the other smoky gray stains are kind of greasy, but this one is a pretty light stain. It goes on and off pretty well. So you're just going to wipe it on and wipe off all the excess, and now I'm going to strike off. And I'm going to take that rag and I'm going to tuck it in between my fingers, and then I'm going to make one pass across the dresser top with the wood grain, and that'll be it. That's the last thing I do. And if you leave streaks, then they'll be going with the wood grain and they should blend in and no one should notice. Hopefully you don't leave streaks, but if you do, you want it to be with the wood grain, and that's the point of striking off. So while that's drying, we're going to move on to these drawers, and I'm going to spray these with one layer of my primer, and this is a shellac based primer, so I don't have to worry about doing any more coats. Just one coat is enough because this is a primer and sealer, and it does excellent against bleed through. And I've only had one case in 2 years of using this primer of bleed through where I had to spray this primer twice, and that may not have been the primer's fault. I may not have sprayed a thick enough coat, I'm not sure, but I have had almost no issues with this in 2 years, and I highly recommend it. It's a little expensive, but it saves a lot of time and it's well worth it. And it's also pretty thin, so it goes through the gun really easily. And these are Harbor Freight guns, so not the best on the market, but they get the job done, and this primer goes through them pretty easily, so I haven't had to worry about any major issues with gumming up. Fortunately, that primer only takes about an hour and a half to dry, so now we're going to move on to painting these. And this is a color that me and my wife picked out, and we were looking at the color cards on the wall at Home Depot, and supposedly this is trending for 2026, and it looked good, so we decided to try it out. Why not? And it looks really well. It looks really nice, and I don't normally do green, but I just decided to see what would happen, because a lot of times I don't really know how things are going to work out. You know, you can have a game plan in mind of what color stain you want to use and what color paint you want to use, but you really don't know what it's going to look like until you do it. So this was kind of a surprise for me too. The name of this paint color is Hidden Gem, and it's kind of a bluish green. That's how it looks like to me anyway. It has a bluish green look to it, but the back of the card says it has a smoky texture also, so I'm not sure about all that, but as far as the color goes, I think it looks pretty good. And I'm going to spray 2 coats of this paint. That's how I always do it. I do 1 coat primer, 2 coats of paint, 2 coats of top coat, and then on the top of the dresser I'll do a 3rd coat of top coat. So now I've got my 2 coats of paint done. Now I'm going to hit it with lacquer, and I always use lacquer in a satin finish. I think satin gives it just the right amount of sheen, and I haven't had any complaints so far. Lacquer does smell pretty bad though, so I recommend respiratory protection while you spray it, because it is very toxic, and I would only spray it in a well ventilated area also. So the top of this dresser is dry, and actually this has been a few days later. I think this was probably a week after I got everything done, because that cold front hit and I just did not want to be out there. So that stain is very dry. It's been sitting for about a week, and I've had a heater directly on it the whole time, so it's been blowing air on this dresser top, so I know for a fact that stain is really well dry. But I still don't want my tape sticking to it, because that tape, if it doesn't pull your stain off, a lot of times it'll leave sticky residue behind. So you want to tuck your paper down into that tape. And unfortunately I didn't cut my paper exactly the way it needed to be, so I'm actually going to stick that tape a little bit to this dresser edge here, but I'm not leaving it for a few days. It's going on, and then I'm taking it off the same day. So I feel pretty good that I'm not going to have any issues with that tape. But if you do put blue tape on your top and you leave it for a week, that might cause issues. So I'm just taking that tape and I am taping underneath the trim, and there's not a lot of ledge to tape onto, but you want to get your tape under that ledge, and then you want to tuck your paper down into that tape, and you want that tape to be perfectly straight. You don't want to have any tape hanging down onto your front, which I do here, and instead of pulling that tape up, I'm just going to take a knife and I'm just going to cut right where that line is, because that's where the dresser top and the frame connect. So that's pretty much where I'm going to cut my tape off there. And if I did not cut this off, you would notice it later when, after painting it. Then when you pull that tape off, you're going to see a line right there where your paint never touched. And then you got to go in and either do it by hand or respray it, which I wouldn't want to respray. I would just take I have small paintbrushes and I would redo it by hand. But that just takes extra time, so it's better to spend a few minutes taking that tape and cutting it off versus spending 20 minutes painting that later. So just make sure that your tape is on really well. And now I'm going to sand the sides of this just because there are brush marks all over. And if there's any paint that's about to chip off, I would rather it chip off now versus at the client's house. So I'm just going to smooth everything out. I'm also going to chip off anything that's ready to fall off anyway. And also, you can see towards the bottom there where it's bare wood, that's some drips from the stripping agent. So I need to smooth that out also. And I need to do this on both sides. I don't know if I filmed both sides, but I'm going to hit the entire dresser, actually, the front also, with this sander because it's rough all over and it just needs to be smoothed out. So I'm actually hitting this with 220 all over. You could hit this with 120 and then go back over it with 220, but I didn't do that. I just did 220 over the whole thing. Now it's time to get these drawers out of here. So we're going to take this into the spray booth and get this process started. And while this is drying, we can work on the drawers. So I'm just going to take my primer and I'm just going to go down and then I'm going to go back up. And that is a layer for me. It's maybe a medium-sized layer. I wouldn't go any heavier than this because then you would start to get runs. And then you gotta spend time sanding those out later. So this is about as far as you can go without runs. And I just do this on both sides and I just have to use one coat and then I can move on to the paint process. So I'm going to spray this and then I have about an hour, hour and a half, and then I can move on to the paint. And if you notice here, I'm spraying at an upward angle just so I get the entire trim. If you go at it straight, you won't get the trim underneath, and then that will show different when you have your paint. And if you were to look underneath, you would see the old paint with the new paint over it. So if you spray at an upward angle on that upper trim, then you're going to cover up the previous paint or previous finish, whatever it was. So now that's drying, so I'm moving on to these drawers and I'm hitting them lightly with 400 grit just to smooth them out a little bit. And I am not pressing down very hard at all on these. I'm basically just using the weight of the sanding pad, and that's it. Now it's time to unwrap these, and this was a little bit of work. All of these drawer liners were hard to get off, so I know a lot of people like to use them, but they are a pain to get off. And I guess that's good. I guess it means they're holding on pretty well. I guess they're made pretty well, but they're hard to get out. And a lot of times I get a little nervous when I see these because a lot of times people will cover up mold or water damage or something with these, so you never know what you're going to get when you take these off. But fortunately, all of these drawers were in great shape. So now I'm going to put on the hardware that was on there previously, and I believe these are champagne bronze, but I'm not 100% sure. They could be champagne gold. They're champagne something, but I think they look good with this color. So now I'm going to move on to painting here, and same thing, just going to make a pass down and a pass back up, and that counts as one layer for me. One thing I've noticed with paint that I use, I get Behr paint from Home Depot, And I've noticed that you can't really use the paint right out of the can. You have to water it down. And I've kind of figured out a way for me to water it down thin enough to where it sprays a real fine mist. But when you do that, you have to move quick or you'll get runs. So you really have to kind of figure out your own preferences. And you can adjust your gun settings, you can adjust your air pressure on your compressor. There's a lot of different ways to set it up. And I'm sure a lot of people do it different. As long as it looks good in the end, it doesn't really matter how you get there. And this is just the first coat. I'm going to come back later and put a second coat on. And make sure that you spray the insides of those drawer frames also, because sometimes you'll get drawers that go into the drawer frame, and if those insides aren't painted, you'll see the difference. This particular dresser has drawers that cover the entire frame, so I guess it doesn't really matter on this one, but I just think it looks better, so I do it on all of them. And this is the point where I get a little stressed out, because this is my first glance at my stain and paint color combination, and so this is kind of where I see, if this is working out or not, but it's also where I see if I didn't tape correctly, and now I've got to redo something. And there are some spots where my tape didn't hold, and now it moved, and I ended up not painting some parts of the dresser that I needed to underneath the trim. But that's not a big deal. I can go ahead and spray my top coat on, and then I will go in and do some touch-ups later. And you can see how foggy this lacquer is, so definitely use this in a well-ventilated area. And I like to spray a layer and then give it about 30 minutes to dry, and then I'll come back, and I like to go over it with 400 grit, over the entire dresser with 400, and then I'll spray the final layer of lacquer, and then I'll also sand that with 400 just to make things as smooth as possible. I believe this is my third layer of lacquer on the top here, and I was very happy with how it turned out. And another thing about doing top coat on these dresser tops is I would recommend wearing some sort of hairnet or hat or something to keep hair from falling down on top of the dresser top, because I have had so many cases where I was done with a dresser and then I see a hair in my dresser top in my lacquer, and then you have to spray the lacquer again to soften it up, and then go in with tweezers and try to dig it out, and that just adds more time to the process. So now this dresser is done, it's time to get it out of the spray booth, and I'm going to fix an issue that I see all the time on almost every dresser that I get, and that is these broken track guides. And this is very normal. I would say almost every dresser has these broken off. And I have these replacements here I got from Amazon, and I can provide a link in the description. But they basically just screw in where the old ones were. So you're just going to unscrew those. And these are the square track guides. They also have rounded ones, and I think they're called clamshell guides. And I have those extras also, but this is the square ones, and these are much easier to replace. And I see this a lot too, where those track guides will get broke off, and then these tracks just get mangled over the years. So I'm just using a tack hammer, some pliers to try to straighten those out, or they'll grind on your track that's in your dresser, and that hurts your ears a lot. And then you're basically just going to put the new one in, and then you screw them back into the same holes that were there originally. I mean, it's really a 5-minute fix, and it's not very hard at all. So that's going to be it for this video. I'm just going to wheel the dresser over to my staging wall, put some stuff on it, and that'll be it. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next one.